Hello, Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and good morning. On behalf of IRS, STPI, and CSCCC, I would like to welcome you all to our event today on PRECOP27 from Paris to Sharm el-Sheikh. We would like to begin with recitation from the Holy Quran.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر
Now, I would like to request President IRS, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz, to please come to the podium and give his welcome remarks.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and a good morning to everyone. Honorable Senator Sherry Rahman, Federal Minister for Climate Change, Excellency Nicolas Gallet, the Ambassador of France, Excellency Tarek Darouk, the Ambassador of Egypt, Ambassador Andreas Ferraresi, the Ambassador of Italy, honorable speakers, diplomats, participants, and dear colleagues. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, which we are co-hosting with CSCCC and STPI. This year marks 30 years since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted, and 7 years since the Paris Agreement at COP21. The slogan for this year is Together for Implementation. The Paris Agreement provides a voluntary approach, and countries individually decide by how much they will reduce their national emissions each year. The planned emission cuts outlined in the NDCs submitted at Glasgow were insufficient to limit global warming to the agreed levels. COP26 ended with a call for countries to put forward revised NDCs within the year. The Glasgow Climate Pact requires that parties strengthen the 2030 targets in the NDCs to align with the Paris goal by the end of 2022 under the Paris Agreement. The unfinished business of Glasgow may be critical whether the international community can respond to increasing climate challenges. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change report for this year states that around half of the world population is highly vulnerable to the impact of climate change. The population is highly susceptible. Regions are 15 times more likely to die to floods, droughts, and storms compared to regions with very low risk. Climate change thus reflects wider patterns of inequality and marginalization, with those who have contributed least to climate change standing to be the most affected. This year, as you all know, our country, Pakistan, suffered great devastation by heavy monsoon rains, which were preceded by fierce heat waves. Scores of other countries all over the world have experienced unusually high temperatures, heat waves, droughts, causing the drying up of rivers, lakes, and ferocious cyclones and forest fires. The threat of climate change thus is upon us all. The upcoming COP27 provides an opportunity for parties and observers to come together and grapple with the challenges posed by climate change. The agenda for COP27 includes 4 main themes, which are climate finance, adaptation, loss and damage, and increased ambition. It is taking place in one of the continents to see whether the developed countries will fulfill their commitments to developing countries with regard to the $100 billion per year financing pledge, as promised at COP15 in Copenhagen. On adaptation, stakeholders are expected to witness a high political desire to increase global funding for adaptation policies. There is a need to obtain assistance for one of the most vulnerable continents and help them adapt to climate change. Loss on damage is a contentious subject, which has been discussed for several years, but with no consensus on any enforceable work plan. The Paris Agreement made only the intention to address loss and damage with technical assistance, but it did not include any liability or compensation for it by developed countries. There have been several attempts to establish a financing mechanism for loss and damage, but without any success. As such, setting up a financing facility may be at center stage of the upcoming COP event. Increasing ambitions entails consolidating the concurrent political commitments by different stakeholders and the wider global community towards the climate cause. The February report of the IPCC states that we must stay below the 1.5-degree temperature increase mark. The report also states that by 2030, emissions level should be halved to this target. Based on the outcome of the Glasgow Climate Pact, if all NDC targets that are pledged for the Paris Agreement were implemented, the international community would still remain much below the 1.5-degree mark. Therefore, the expectations at Sharm el-Sheikh are that countries would increase their ambitions and give new pledges to reduce emissions and stay below the 1.5-degree mark. COP27 will also host one of the 3 technical dialogues as part of the 2021-23 Global Stocktake. The outcome of the Global Stocktake are intended to inform NDCs, negotiations, and enhance international cooperation for climate action with the aim of increasing ambitions. Also at this event, developing countries are expected to demand substantial progress on the global goal on adaptation. So at Sharm el-Sheikh, countries, despite political differences, would need to work together to mitigate the harmful effects of climate change. Let us hope that the upcoming COP event meets its projected targets and sets the ball rolling to make the world a safer place for us and for our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz, for your welcome remarks. Now, I would like to request the Honorable Federal Minister for Climate Change, Senator Sherry Rahman, to please take the podium and give her keynote address.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz, His Excellency Nicolas Gailly, Ambassador of France, His Excellency Dr. Darouk, Ambassador of Egypt, who is our host for COP27 this year. I see other friends in the audience, Dr. Abid Sureri, Aisha Khan, who's made sure I get here today. And is Kaka Khair Saab here? No. All right. And Mujtaba from our ministry. I see other excellencies from different embassies. Well, thank you and good morning and assalamu alaikum. I am told I can speak as long as I want, which is a terribly dangerous thing to give to a politician. Although many of you see me as a technocrat as well, I wear many hats, but really grateful for this convening. It's important, it's timely, and it's critical for us to build our goals on inclusion and creating consensus in civil society, which we see as very important stakeholders in taking forward any of the goals the government, the provinces, the federation, and of course the Ministry of Climate Change sets for ourselves. They are meaningless as climate goals if they are created in private, behind closed doors, and then just read out as international forums. They need to have buy-in from civil society, from young people particularly, whom we have to have a meeting with again soon, and other actors and thought leaders, lead agents, media, as well as academics. But most importantly are people who run businesses and households, because without them, there's going to be just a lot of shuffling of paper and very little change on the ground. So I can speak a lot. I always, for an effective speech on which I know a little bit, just a little bit, I think it's best I address what is on my mind today. And that is very germane to this conference, and also what Nadeem Saab said earlier in terms of how we define our path ahead for this particular COP27. So first of all, what I'd like to say is that we need to manage our expectations. Why? Because COP27s are broad forums, they're multilateral forums, basically run by the conventions of the UNFCCC, as you all know, and they lay out frameworks. They create an enabling environment for many nations. It's like a mini UN for climate, literally, to come together and navigate the contentious and very compelling paths towards managing our climate and making the planet livable, not just for the next century or the turn of the century towards which we have all set our goals. Well, at least these conferences have set their goals too, and find roadmaps and benchmarks for delivering on how that change is to be battled or countered. So, I mean, I would not, first of all, think that this would be a place where you can come out with a slogan that changes everything on the ground. There is that expectation. It's not in this room because you have an informed thought leadership here, but there is an expectation in society that somehow convenings will change everything. No, they are meant to shift the needle, and they're meant to create another milestone on agendas. What these milestones do is, of course, bind people in moral frameworks. There are no legal bindings to any of this. We are all bound morally when we walk away with our own key takeaways that this is what we have committed to. For instance, countries have committed to nationally determined contributions that we will reduce emissions by so much, we will enhance adaptation by so much, we will look at our relationship with nature and how we nurture it as opposed to destroy it. I'm putting a very broad brush on this. And there's nothing to make anybody's commitments there binding or enforceable by any kind of law or any kind of binding instrument that compels sovereign states towards any level of compliance that will then make these goals a tangible reality to be rushed towards. Now, what are we rushing towards? Not our goals collectively. Humanity is not rushing towards any goals. It is rushing towards a 3-degree world, or perhaps even more, which is exactly double of what these conferences, and they're very important conferences, aim to do at a distant date or end of the century. Well, that's too far for many of us. As you all know, I won't repeat what went on in Pakistan, but I will say what went on in Pakistan this year as a century-breaking climate event will not stay in Pakistan. That will be our slogan for COP27. And Pakistan at COP27 is aiming to do more than a few things. I won't numerically enumerate them right now, because as we go into the COP and as we keep consulting with each other, including the provinces and civil society, we will be enhancing and changing our goals. So what does that mean? It means that we are looking at how we can take the best away, not for ourselves alone, but for a collective regional and global format to work with. As leaders of G77, which is the largest group, it's not one, it is the largest group of countries that are negotiating at the COP27, we obviously have a pole position. We are chair of the country. The Prime Minister will be making a statement there on which will be at the Leaders Summit, a country statement, and of course, at the ministerial level and with a large team with me, which is civil society. I'm hoping they're all there as long as possible because we see everyone as a resource. This is not government and civil society. We're there as Pakistan, as one country, and we will all work as one country. So I'm hoping for everyone's input and active participation there. We will also be, the Prime Minister will be chairing a joint initiative, a presidential one with Norway, with the Prime Minister of Norway, which is very important. It is about our lives, but it's significant that Norway will be co-chairing. It is like a burden share where vulnerable communities and countries that need to bend more towards sustainability and those goals will be putting their asks on the table. And really, that brings me to the next point. And of course, we'll continue for 12 long, onerous days. I've never stayed in any country 12 days for a vacation even. So we will be continuing with the help of our permanent representatives at the UN, where we formulate some policies too. We'll be going forward with the group of 77. And part of Egypt's task, Excellency, and ours will be managing anger as well as expectations. Now, it won't be anger from the chair, which is Pakistan. We've already said we don't see ourselves as part of the problem in any negotiation. You're going to a table to negotiate. You're not there to add to the problems, but you certainly state your case, which is compelling, without being adversarial. That is the whole power and point of diplomacy. Otherwise, you're already starting another war, and we have enough of those, don't we? And the cost of those wars. So Pakistan is leading this, and I have also cautioned all others that can help that there are some very angry countries out there, and justifiably so. I won't name them. They will be quite happy to identify themselves at the conference, as you know, Ambassador. And for them, it's a fight for survival, as they say. We've had several pre-COP discussions, and we will continue to do that. We do this on Zoom in the evenings, or we can't get to colder climates or distant countries because we have to work over here as well. We are meeting, and the sense of the pulse of the least developed and developing countries, which is in preponderance, not of resources, but numbers, and numbers matter at multilateral forums or even parliaments. And here the numbers are in favor of serious change. And that's your Together for Implementation, header. Why is this important? And I'm very glad that the right noises are being made, because if you don't make the right noises, you get nowhere. If you don't have goals, you haven't had the conversation, you haven't defined your ask. It may be on paper, it may be words, but without the words, you have nothing to work towards. Without the laws that we make in Parliament, we have nothing to hold standards up to. This thing is really irritating. If you could take it away, thank you. And so that's what we're doing over there. We're navigating a new path to the planet's survival. It's burning up, and this is the decisive decade. So two things. One is, from my sense of where we are entirely, is that we are hurtling towards a 3-degree plus world, which means for us, those who are nearer the equator, who are obviously have very few resources for what is known as better preparedness, well, we will continue to be in the front line of climate catastrophes brought on by change we did not have a major contribution to. I don't like to say no fault of our own, because, it's human nature to say, I didn't do this. Having said that, we can take responsibility for how we build on riverbeds and not, or rebuild on riverbeds. So, but that's just one part of it. That's a small part of it. We are very small emitters in the global pie and scheme of things. And I hope that message is actually out there loud and clear by now. It's been a reality for a long time. My first op-ed on how we were small emitters and not victims, but recipients of a gross climate injustice was 7 years ago. We're still exactly where we are, but our message is out there now. And I think that is the message of many countries seeking to leverage justice from the multilateral system. Now, as you know, getting justice gone on for many centuries since the invention of the multilateral system. Part of it was a rules-based order. I don't want to get into all of that, but there is a Paris rule book that we all look towards, and that governs where we go now. It governs where we go now, but it does not adjudicate between the paths. What do we do? What does the global north and the global south do when there are expectations that are as divergent as the north of Pakistan and the south of Pakistan in terms of climate, right? They're completely divergent. We're a country with very unique topographies, which has been transformed by the current catastrophic flooding. The south of the country is transformed. It is no longer what it was before the flood. It will never be what it was. It will not go back to being what it was. I don't mean human settlements. I don't mean even the way the river flows, because this was not a riverine flood, which we still know how to contain after. Even if it's in high flood, there is an ability or some level of capacity to predict it, if not manage it, but certainly some predictability as to which path it will flow. Today, we have had new kinds of climate change inflict themselves on Pakistan as a message. Like I told the UN Secretary General, this was a message, a memo to humanity, and it came via Pakistan. How long are we willing to tolerate this dystopia on our doorstep, which was caused by other countries? I'm not abdicating responsibility here. I'm making that very plain for how we build or rebuild, or how we manage our populations or our own need or our economy. No, I'm saying something very fundamental to the whole point of the bargain between the global north and south that has become the crux or the core of the COP26-27 negotiations. And that bargain, I have repeatedly said, in my view, stands broken. It has to be fixed. Why? Because not just for climate justice, not just for parochial national gains, but because that is the only way humanity will survive this. It is a test for the human race and what it privileges for its people. Survival, prosperity, growth with a sense of responsibility, transitions, energy transitions that are just, embedded in some level of justice. And I can talk to you about what that means, but also the ability and capacity, building the ability and the capacity to understand that we have gone too far with this planet, and that our lifestyles, our carbon-rich lifestyles, all of us, including elites in this room, because anyone who is in this room is an elite. Even your ability to come into this room tells me that we are of a certain in the whole world, within countries, outside countries. As you know, Oxfam has repeatedly said there's a 1% that lives very well, that is at another level, literally another planet of prosperity, well-being, and luxury. I will call it what it is. And that we are today in the opposite, as a country, the opposite of that 1%. We are part of the other 1%. That club that is at the bottom of the climate pyramid, along with many others who are surviving, who are now, if anyone thinks this is not a race for survival, needs a reset, needs a reboot to how they think about climate and how it will impact our lives, our own lives. So you will feel it last as elites within the bottom of the pyramid, because you're still elites, but the vulnerable communities already feel it very hard, very fast. They don't have water in their taps, even if they have scarcity to 2025. While you say there's water everywhere, there will still be not a drop to drink or for the Rabi crop, because that's climate change for you. The erratica, the constant unpredictability, and the need for resources to turn into nightmarish impositions of disaster on the human race. So water, which is fundamental to our survival, turned into an instrument of terrible disaster. 1,700 people dead and 33 million affected is a big figure to wrap your head around. And if anyone thinks that we can go on with business as usual, either in Pakistan or outside Pakistan, they have got their head in ostrich land. Okay, and that's either deliberate or disingenuous or plain ignorant, or all three. And that's got to change. So COP's responsibility principle will be to change that sense of complacency that we can kick the can of change, personal as well as collective, towards a future, that end of century. No, the decisive time or decade is now. It's this decade or nothing. For countries like Pakistan, I don't know, the North will have to, they're in colder climates, it will come later to them. Europe will feel the burning summers, the forest fires they have. So will parts of the United States. California, as you know, is drought-ridden. And there's a whole litany of countries that are not nearer the equator, but in better longitudes, shall we say, but are supremely affected or afflicted in pockets. And they're beginning to see that as their memo from nature. But that's obviously and apparently not enough to trigger change. We're all in this together, but it has not triggered change. For Pakistan, it can't be business as usual. We're going to have to adapt better. And we're going to have to understand that when we are told, heighten your ambition. Yes, sure, it's easy for us to heighten our ambition. We have to anyway. Ambition meaning on mitigation. We have to anyway. We can't afford the import bills for fossil fuels that make up our base load of energy. We can't get the gas we need on the international bidding, Hunger Games, as I call it, where you are bidding for gas against some very rich countries. The Ukraine war has seen to that. And the supply chain disruptions, the inflation in most of the world will impact how we all live, will impact our exchange rates, will impact our macroeconomic economies, and it will keep on impacting in cascades of deprivation, fragility, and extreme vulnerability for the poorest of each country, including Pakistan. The poorer will just be more poorer, and then there will be more added to that because of this climate catastrophe. We had thought of 11 million people being added to the poverty line, under the poverty line, but I believe that figure, every week the figure changes. They are so dynamic that our partners are having trouble making up the needs assessment. The complex business of needs assessment is still underway. It should be done by the 24th or 25th of October, but there we are. So it's a mind sharpening moment. And if we don't understand the power of what we can do, instead of the collective malaise we've all gotten into, because human habits are very hard to change. They're the hardest things to change, and we are not addressing that. All of this will need behavior change. Now, plastics may not be a huge problem in anyone's mind. It is in mine. And while our bottles in the offices, government, here, everywhere may be recyclable, they send a bad signal. Elites should not be using any kind of plastic. I'm sorry. That means a little bit of pain. That means I carry a glass water bottle around, right? My office can't have any, it hasn't, or home. How many of you have made that transition at your home and offices? Please raise your hands. Quite a few people. Fantastic. More than half the room still left. Next time, I don't want to see that we have any hands left, because honestly, like charity, change begins at home. I didn't see Jinnah Institute raise their hand. Yes, you did, right? Good, good. No, only glass. But then glass is expensive. After the bottles you can throw away or put in the trash for the poor, has industry developed, or all the big coalitions? I was addressing one last week. Fantastic data, lots of money employed, speaking to each other. Has anyone developed a cheap, low-cost alternative to plastic bottles? Because the world is not going to stop using them. Hello? Until they're given that. We will. We should. A signal is crucial. But the poor who need to travel to a field to figure out what happened to their crop in the blistering, scorching sun, because we did get to 53 degrees this year, the hottest place on the planet, or those in the factories, or those working in urban economies. I'm sorry. I'm in no position to tell them to start boiling water where they don't get gas, to say, okay, now, you've got to just manage with glass bottles. That's just not affordable for them in the long haul. Or the tourists that are polluting our glaciers, right? The tourists better stop. I have sent a note to Gilgit-Baltistan that this better stop, because they really need to clamp down on that. Turning our big mountains into garbage dumps is just not acceptable. And a lot of those tourists, a large percentage is international travelers who would know better in their own country, if ours don't. So it's time to, for the provinces and federating units to start acting at home. This is crucial. If you don't act at home, you have very little case to make anywhere, is my view. And I believe that's also shared by the government, which is scrambling as we speak to understand how we map the risk reduction. That's the 8 o'clock meeting this morning at the PM's house, that how do we get a risk reduction map going? So in the rush to rebuild, when someone's building a kacha house, because all their lives they've built that, and they've been told by consultants that those are very climate friendly, because for the older climate, they probably were, but they're no longer viable now with the kind of flooding and torrential downpours we can expect. So where do those people go before they start building? And there's a compulsion to seek a habitat for the human being, to seek their livelihood and their habitat. That's the first goal. So please cater to that, as opposed to imposing top-down planning and saying, this is how it should be. No, it's got to be catering to people at the bottom of the pyramid who have to rebuild their lives. We need to plan around their needs. Right now, there is no formula for this level of risk reduction mapping. Nobody knows. We've had teams come from friendly countries. Today also we had the China, it's an entire ministry for disaster reduction and disaster planning. You've all been meeting with them. And they're sitting with our NDRMF, and they've got different topographies. Pakistan has the highest glaciers in the world outside the polar region, the largest number. And then we have a delta that is bone dry before the rains and will become bone dry, Having said that, the lake in the middle of Sindh, the huge lake, is probably not going away. So that province already is going to be different. It's not going to be, you can't live where you used to. People will not be able, they're trying, but they will not be. And they will not be able to grow the same crops or locate their manufacturing or value additions, for instance, like dates, the Khairpur crop will all change. The export will go, the sugar's all gone for this year, big cash crop for export. The wheat is under pressure. Punjab will probably still be able to, it will still be able to grow its wheat, but it doesn't have enough water in the right place, in the right catchment of Mangla. So that's the extreme weather. You have drought, you have extreme torrential rain. It could be in the north, it could be any other place next time. The risk reduction mapping needs to be done now. And it needs to be done by people who know how to do this. So while Turkey sent a huge team, China sent it because they have very large capacity for this. They're still struggling. The Netherlands has asked to send a team. I've sent them a visa letter. Please come right away because they have dikes that are built against. So we have multiple challenges and risks, climate and extreme weather risks to plan for. That is the first priority right now after resettling people. Even if they've gone to the wrong place, they have to go to homes. Don't be callous. Oh, don't resettle people. As it is, they're going to be working, living this winter in tents, in tarpaulins, where the temperature does fall to 10 degrees. Even in Sindh, the temperature falls in winter quite a bit. So it's not going to be anywhere near the comfort of living in a house where there's no gas heating. This is where we are. And there will be some people in the north, there is displacement in the north where it will be -4. So winter is coming. We have 20.6 million in need out of the 33 million. And that's still the size of Switzerland and Portugal together. The 33 million were 3 countries. What was it? Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark, I think. Yes. 3 countries. And everyone's saying, oh, you couldn't manage it. No, we could not. And nobody can. I challenge any country. Look what happened in New Orleans 20 years ago, whenever it was. Went on and on and on. One district, one city. This is 3 countries together. Well, 13 million are not so much in need. Now only 20 are, but that's huge. It will take decades for us to recover. So let's not be complacent. Let us put I will not state what is wrong with climate finance. Everybody here knows, and I'm sure there will be people speaking about it. There is plenty wrong with climate finance at the COP27 system. Absolutely. It is geared towards keeping people talking. It is geared towards very little to trickle down to the actual developing countries and their needs. And by the time the project is realized, materialized, the technical experts show up, they're ghost experts, okay? That's my new name for them. They're ghost experts. They are technically in your office, but they're not really there, mentally or physically. They're barely on WhatsApp. And that's what's going on. They're the ghost technical capacity barely arrives. It arrives 3 years later with the funds. By then, the needs have changed on the ground. We don't have the same needs we had 3 years ago. Sindh, Punjab, KP, Gilgit-Baltistan, AJK, and Balochistan do not have the same needs. They are magnified, amplified by a quantum. So if that is what is going to be on offer, we will still try to manage the angle, but I can't speak to those who will be angrier. You compete for what? 154 million is all we've gotten so far from the entire green finance system with its 3 funding streams, GCF, GEF, and the so-called adaptation fund, which has never been capitalized by the global north. It's all talk so far. And in doing so, Pakistan has received 154 million. That is less than the fund to the World Bank and ADB repurposed immediately. Climate resilience is all repurposed. There was some expert speaking for humanitarian response. How else do we get BISP to deliver 70 billion in 30 days to people in need right away? That's the first need. They've got to have that 25,000. They don't have an income. So immediate frontline was, of course, climate funds, anybody else's funds available, all gone. They have to go. So don't anyone be lecturing me about, somebody was waving a letter at the first climate council yesterday, somebody who should have known better, that, oh, there's this recharge or something project. I said, please sit down. All the funds for that are gone. When they reappear again, if and when they do, in the long drawn out pipeline of negotiations with consultants who often take back a lot of the money that comes into that pipeline, even if they don't, by the time that project actually appears on the ground to send to the province its needs, oh, come on. Is that what is on offer to those who are taking the brunt of the global north's carbon-rich lifestyles? Because that's what they are. And there will be no more not calling a spade a spade. The Prime Minister is going to be very polite, but then I can't speak for others. It's going to be very hard to manage the anger of the small island states. Mujtaba, you know, I was at a conference recently where it was bursting its banks on the sidelines of the UN, their anger. They're saying, so while they're more resilient, we need to build our own resilience. We need to focus on our own needs and figuring out how we sustain this exogenous shock. Frankly, the big been more empathetic. We are still paying $22 billion in just interest payments. You can entirely blame us for bad economic management, all Pakistani governments, by all means. But is this what to lob on us at this point? I don't think so. So it's all going to be about two things, in my view, all cut the jargon aside. Capacity, building capacity, adaptation capacity, resilience capacity, and the funds to power that. Without that, telling us that your PSDPs will change the game, doesn't need a cop, right? We already know that. But we're going to be responsible players here, and we would urge everybody else to be the same, because that is the whole point of any diplomacy. And this is the primary global forum for climate diplomacy. Let's use it well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for your very comprehensive and illuminating remarks. You very rightly said that it is a fight for survival. And on that note, we have a message from Honorable Minister, His Excellency Sami Shukri, who is the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he is the COP27 President designate.
Today, we are less than days away from COP27. In a year when the focus on the global climate agenda can easily slip away under the pressure of other competing priorities, science tells us that we do not only need to hold tight to our commitments, but we need to do more, demonstrate further ambition, and act swifter and more decisively. Unfortunately, there is a growing sense that the Paris temperature goal is slipping away. The adaptation gap is rapidly growing. Climate finance is significantly lower than needs and expectations. Meanwhile, loss and damage is becoming a recurrent reality that reminds us of the critical need for robust and additional action and support. The heartbreaking scenes from Pakistan and the untold suffering of tens of thousands of victims of this climate calamity, the unprecedented rise in temperature and forest fires in Europe and the United States, all confirm that there is no plan, that the last U-turn is only a few kilometers away. There is no excuse for allowing the devastating Pakistani floods, or the Adai cyclone of southern Africa, or the shrinking shores of many islands and mainlands to become a regular feature on our news boards. At COP27, the COP of implementation, I urge all governments and stakeholders to double up their efforts and listen to the millions of people calling for an urgent and qualitative response to the climate emergency. As we inch closer to COP27, I urge all countries that have not done so to update their NDCs, gear their development towards a green, low carbon, and resilient pathway, and agree on an ambitious mitigation work program that premises itself on staying way below 2 degrees Celsius while keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, to also deliver remarkable progress on the global goal on adaptation, thereby paving the way for a transformative adaptation is impactful and well-resourced, and that developed countries meaningful financial pledges, including for the GCF and Adaptation Fund beyond the current level, and more importantly, ensure that 2023 is the year where the symbolic 100 billion US pledge is finally honored. Parties should also honor the pledge to double adaptation finance. All parties must work together to ensure a credible outcome that responds to the gravity of loss and damage, and provide developing countries with means and resources to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. We must all continue to develop and reinforce the normative framework and operational means needed to support the vision of a just transition that does not overlook the relevant socioeconomic variables and needs. At COP27, I encourage all of us to get it and do it right and fully.
Now, for special remarks, I would like to request Ambassador of France to Pakistan, His Excellency, Mr. Nicholas Gallet, to please take the podium and give his remarks.
Thank you. Senator Sherry Rehman, Federal Minister for Climate Change. Safir Mas, Sheikh Tarek, Zaroug. Ambassador Nadim Reyes, President of the Institute of Regional Studies. Also say hello to our Italian colleague, Ambassador Ferrarese. Mrs. Aisha Khan, Chief Executive of the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Well, I will certainly not try and to challenge the eloquence and passion demonstrated by Minister Rehman in her remarks, and I will ask you to forgive me in advance to make a statement that will be certainly more bureaucratic, but also oriented on the implementation and action dimensions. And of course, starting with the floods in Pakistan and a short remarks about the emergency action that France took, and then move to the more global question that will be discussed in Sharm el-Sheikh. The unprecedented floods that Pakistan recently faced are a clear manifestation of the climate emergency we are now experiencing around the world. And as you know, temperatures and forest fires. Some towns in Northern Europe have experienced temperature that were never registered before. The scale of the devastation linked to the recent floods in Pakistan is a heartbreaking reminder of the terrible human impact on climate change, and it's certainly a call for action. At the end of August, President Macron wanted to immediately demonstrate France's solidarity and compassion with the Pakistani people, and also with the Pakistani authorities who were facing these tragic floods. In addition to sending non-food items and equipment, including tents, the French government has dispatched a team of doctors and nurses who worked with their Pakistani colleagues during 2 weeks to respond to the medical needs of the population in the city of Badin in Sindh. A team of experts who trained more than 50 technicians in Karachi to use the 83 high-capacity water pumps, which were left to their Pakistani colleagues after the French team left Pakistan. And very recently, a team of 40 experts from the French civil security units, whom I welcomed last Friday when they arrived in Karachi. They are now deployed on site in the Sindh province to install and operate a water purification unit, which will provide 250 liters of drinking water per day to the population. In addition, France is sending by sea a 50-meter-long transportable Bailey Bridge, which will be deployed in flood-affected areas after it reaches Karachi Harbor at the end of this month. The French government has also allocated an additional €1 million contribution to the World Food Programme for an integrated nutrition safety net project for pregnant and lactating women in Sindh. And yesterday, I met with representatives of 3 French international non-governmental organizations who have been working in Pakistan for many years to hand over my government's financial contribution to their ongoing relief operation in Sindh, Balochistan, and KP for a total of €1 million. This humanitarian assistance in the field of nutrition and food security, water and sanitation and health will reach nearly 90,000 beneficiaries in the 3 provinces. This is for the emergency response, and this is very clearly implementation and action. But obviously, this is for the short term because we all know that the challenges go far beyond. What Pakistan experienced recently may be a sign of things to come, and in many countries, we have seen similar floods in the last days in Nigeria or in Vietnam. While disaster preparedness and humanitarian assistance will remain key to respond to such emergency, climate adaptation and climate resilience become increasingly crucial. The recent floods have also reminded us that women are particularly vulnerable to the effect of climate change. I mentioned pregnant women in particular, and are more likely to live in poverty statistically. Efforts should be made to pay attention to their specific needs, and we should not lose sight that women also play a significant role in combating the adverse effects of climate change. They manage the natural environment, they produce food, they contribute to improve the quality of life in their communities. Based on that assessment, I'm pleased to announce that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, the French Embassy and the French Development Agency have launched the first Pakistan Gender and Climate Awards with a call for applications open until November 1st, so it's still time. These awards will promote the inclusion and leadership of women in climate action, drawing attention to good practices and concrete solutions led by women from civil society for a more fair, equal, and healthy planet. And I would be very honored, Madam Minister, if you could attend the ceremony when this award will be presented. The COP27 will be a key moment to talk about the climate emergency and challenges faced by countries like Pakistan. The G20 summit to be held in Bali at the end of November will also be another crucial moment. These 2 international events, along with the publication of the post-disaster needs assessment, should pave the way for an international conference on the rehabilitation and reconstruction of flood-affected areas in Pakistan, as announced by President Macron and Prime Minister Sharif when they met in New York on 20th September. This conference should, of course, focus on climate resilient reconstruction-related financing and on accelerating transition to renewable energy. The Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 conference will be a great opportunity to put collective action front and center again in the fight against climate change in the context of an acute food security and energy crisis as results of, in particular, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the increased international and economic tensions which resulted. I would like now to touch on 2 subjects to be discussed at the COP27, and which the Minister Rehman already mentioned at length, which are particularly important in the context of the recent floods here in Pakistan, namely climate adaptation and resilience, and then loss and damage. 2 chapters of the Paris Agreement provide a framework and several ongoing initiatives that can help Pakistan respond to its ongoing climate crisis. So first, climate adaptation and resilience. That's Article 2.1 and 7 of the agreement, is to enable human societies and ecosystems to cope with the current and future impacts of climate change. The Glasgow Compact, a key deliverable of the COP26, included a commitment by developed countries to double their climate finance for adaptation in developing countries by 2025 from 2019 levels. In addition to strengthening its national adaptation strategy through national action under a plan published in 2018, as well as Climate and Resilience Act, which came into force in 2021, France has committed to devote 2 billion euros per year to adaptation in development countries from 2021 to 2026. That is 1/3 of its international climate funding, and France alone contributes around 10% of international financing dedicated to adaptation. France is also mobilized to strengthen prevention and information on the risk of hydrometeorological and climate hazards through the CRUISE initiative, meaning climate risk and early warning systems. Since 2015, this initiative has funded projects in more than 50 countries for a total amount of $60 million, half of which were funded by the French government. This commitment is fully in line with the UN Secretary General's call for universal early warning coverage within 5 years. With regard to loss and damage now, that's Article 6 of the agreement, while the Paris Agreement doesn't provide for a financial compensation system for the damage suffered by developing countries, it includes a range of measures to strengthen the protection and resilience of the most vulnerable countries. A Glasgow dialogue was established at COP26 to address all sides of that issue. As part of this dialogue, France and the EU have called for a better inventory of needs on the ground, the strengthening of existing tools, and the operationalization of the Santiago network created by COP25 to catalyze technical assistance in this area. It is, of course, and Madam Minister, you stressed that, to do more and better in terms of loss and damage, to have the most vulnerable countries. We are aware of this, and we have stepped up our efforts and across the entire continuum of relevant activities in this area, whether it be the implementation of the early warning system, the initiative CRUISE I just mentioned, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian aid, or support for insurance systems. Better coordination of actions related to loss and damage is essential, and we strongly support the Santiago network created at the COP25 and the Global Climate Risk Shield developed by the German G7 presidency. To conclude, the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement is the only collective compass we have for international climate action. It is the fruit of many compromises and a common framework for climate action with differentiated implementation depending on the context of each country. I would like, obviously, to wish the government of Egypt and the government of Pakistan, who was invited to co-chair the meeting, the best of luck. As far as I understand from your words, Madam Minister, it will be a very lively conference. And we wish, of course, our Egyptian friends all the best in this regard. It's a very important moment, of course, for climate change. And unfortunately, the sad situation that we are seeing now in Pakistan will give a particular role to your country, Madam Minister, to express the preoccupation of vulnerable countries and more globally the international community on climate change. Thank you very much. Shukran, Sayyid Safir. Thank you very much. Shukriya.
Thank you so much. Now, I would like to request Ambassador of the Arab Republic of Egypt to Pakistan, His Excellency Dr. Tariq Daroug, to please give his special remarks.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. Honorable Senator Shari Rahman, the Minister of Climate Change, dear Ambassador Nicolas Gallet, dear Ambassador Nadim Riaz. I will be brief in comparison to my predecessors. In fact, a lot of things had been told. And ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, It's my great pleasure to be among this selected group of thinkers and eminent persons who are concerned with the climate change. Allow me in the beginning, on behalf of the COP27 presidency, which represent the African continent, to welcome all participants and concerned parties in this very important event next November in Sharm el-Sheikh. I would like also to express Egypt's support and sympathy with Pakistan and its people with regards to the floods disaster in various regions of the country. This disaster is a demonstration on the negative impact of climate change in the Asian region. Ladies and gentlemen, let me share with you Egypt's hope to make progress in the upcoming conference in priority areas such as climate financing, adaptation, and loss and damage, to keep pace with the progress that the world hopes to achieve in mitigation and carbon neutrality efforts. This indeed is a new approach given previous COPs mainly focused on mitigation, reducing emissions to limit climate damage. I would like also to mention three very significant remarks that the international community should look into. The first one is the fact that we cannot underplay the threat that humanity is facing due to the climate change. 4% of global economic output could be lost by 2050 due to climate change. And 5 million people die every year because of temperature extremes, which will only get worse as temperatures increase. The second thing is that the COP27 presidency points to the need to first meet current financial commitments with the $100 billion goal and the doubling of global adaptation finance, and take global ambition on finance further if we are to deliver effective climate action. There can be no room for delay in the fulfillment of climate pledges and backtracking on hard-earned gains in the global fight against climate change. We must work together for implementation. We need to act and act now to save lives and livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Several, and some we are taking to COP. I'll share the one that was screened and shared with the first ever Climate Change Council yesterday at PM House. So I think you might also like to see it. As soon as it's downloaded, the president has been very kind of us to be able to play it. So whenever that's ready, we'll be, and I just want to take the opportunity to thank the two ambassadors here of France for all the support, particularly the material support, and the dewatering pumps have been the best. Actually, they've been very useful. And to Ambassador Tariq for all his leadership on this conference and for keeping us well plugged into an evolving agenda. And also the Ambassador of Italy, who's kind enough to be here with us and has always been a great leader on PAC-Italy bilateral commitments, but also on climate change. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us for the inaugural. I would now request our panelists to please stand up for a group photo. And then I would request our co-organizers, Mr. Abid Suleri, Ms. Aisha Khan, and also Ambassador Shafkat Kakakhil, if they could join us for the group photo before we move to the panel discussion. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister for Climate Change, Sherry Rahman, Honorable Minister, Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Sami Shukri, His Excellency Mr. Nicholas Gale, Ambassador of France to Pakistan, and His Excellency Dr. Tariq Daroug, Ambassador of Arab Republic of Egypt to Pakistan. Thank you so much for joining us. Now I would like to move on to the panel. I would like to request the panelists to please make their way towards the stage so that we can begin the next session. If I could please have on stage Mr. Syed Mushtaba Hussain, Mr. Bilal Anwar, Dr. Abid Suleri, and Ms. Aisha Khan so that we can start our next panel. Sorry, we'll just give 1 minute so that Aisha Khan can come back. I would please request everyone to take their seats and settle down so we can start the panel discussion. The first speaker we have today would be Syed Mushtaba Hussain, who is a Senior Joint Secretary, Minister of Climate Change, and he will be talking about nationally determined contributions. Sir, would you like to speak from there?
Thank you to the Institute of Regional Studies. Dear participants, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. So I'll be speaking very briefly, I guess. We are short of time. So in the interest of time, I'll be speaking very briefly on the purpose and objective of nationally determined contributions. So as we all understand that there were like two landmark agreements on environment and climate change in the history of humanity. First, it was the Conference on Environment and Development, what we call the Earth Summit, that was held in 1992, which actually brought the agenda of environment on the global scenario. And the second agreement was the Paris Agreement in 2015. This was one of the landmark agreements in which more than 196 countries agreed to frame their contributions in terms of reducing the GHG emissions, what we call the nationally determined contributions. So Pakistan, as a commitment to the Paris Agreement, Pakistan submitted its first indices back in 2016 after it ratified the Paris Agreement in November 2016. And then as a run-up to the COP26 in Glasgow, Pakistan updated its nationally determined contributions And in that, Pakistan agreed to reduce its GHG emissions by a factor of 50%. 15% is on voluntary basis, and 35% is conditional upon provision of finance, technology, and capacity building. And in that, Pakistan agreed as an objective to fulfill its commitments. Pakistan agreed in reducing its emissions in the energy transition to renewable energy, 60% of that by 2030, and also reducing emissions in terms of infusing the e-vehicles into the transportation process by 30% by 2030. And also Pakistan agreed to reduce its emissions in going towards nature-based solutions. We have, you all would have known, there is a flagship project by the name of 10 billion tree tsunami program. That is a program throughout Pakistan in which it is based on 50% contribution, 50% is given by the federal government and 50% by the provinces. So, and other nature-based solutions like the Protected Areas Initiative. So in that also, Pakistan agreed to increase its protected areas to 15% from the current level of 12%. So these are some of the interventions that Pakistan agreed in the indices. And I would also be highlighting some of the challenges that the government and we are facing in terms of implementing the indices. First is the lack of coordination. Indices, as we all understand, will not succeed without the right level of integration at national and provincial levels. There is a dire need to strengthen the enabling environment for implementation of indices. This can be done through the development of a common platform and specific working groups in order to ensure the availability of updated and automated response line registry system on indices. The other challenge that we are facing in terms of rolling out the indices is the inadequate reporting mechanism. The multi-step process of measurement, reporting, and verification to measure the amount of GHG emissions is reduced by a specific mitigation activity is not available in case of Pakistan. Although the Global Change Impact Studies Center has initiated work on formulation of national registry, but it will take almost 2 to 3 years for completion. The other challenge I would highlight is financing, and probably one of the speakers would be explaining it in more detail. Unless and until we have our in the financing in our PSDPs, as well as the access to different international climate finance windows, we will be in a tough position to achieve these indices. And the other aspect is the capacity of the provinces. So there's a big gap in terms of the level of understanding that we have at the federal level, and the level of understanding and the will to implement these indices at the provincial level. So capacity is another challenge that we have seen. The progress so far, we have developed a roadmap, what we call an implementation framework. And this implementation framework has been shared with all the stakeholders at the federal and provincial level. As you would understand, that climate change is a cross-cutting sector. So different federal ministries like the Ministry of Food Security, Ministry of Energy, Water, Ministry of Planning, Development, and Special Initiatives, they are all part of the process. And not only the federal ministries, but also the provincial departments, different departments like irrigation, food, energy, all they are part of our implementation stakeholders. So we have developed this plan and we have circulated it to all the stakeholders, and we have received input from all of them. And we are in the process of compiling the inputs. And once these inputs are compiled, the next stage is to look for financing. And that's a big challenge, as I already highlighted, because in the implementation plan, we will have a number of policy and project interventions for which we need financing. And that is some of the challenge that we have seen so far. And so I'm open to questions. So this is an update on the NDC so far. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We will be having a Q&A at the end of the panel discussion, so please save your questions for the panelists. Next, we have Mr. Bilal Anwar, who is the CEO of NDRMF, and he will be talking to us about climate finance.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and giving the opportunity to talk to this very specialized group of people and on an extremely important topic, climate finance. The Madam Minister actually set a very good context earlier on, and I think the one resounding message which came out of her talk was, yes, there is a need to scale up the ambition, there's a need to scale up the action, but everything, of course, need to be fueled up, will need to be supported by the finances. Now, the climate finance, it has become such a global talk right now, and everyone is talking about it, whether the need for it or the availability for it or the accessibility of it. Now, the framers and the H's of the Climate Change Convention back in 1992, they were very much conscious about the need for financing. And there are several articles in the Climate Change Convention which very directly, indirectly point out towards the need for financing. And in the very early phase, it was very well understood that no climate action is going to be implemented, or none of the actions are going to become implementable unless the financing and the capacity building, as well as the support in terms of the technology transfer, is going to become readily available to these group of countries. Now, I think it becomes quite a surprise that how well understood and how well enshrined this whole issue was at the very early phase and the stage of the whole climate change, global climate change debate. And we're still actually lagging at a situation where there are huge funding gaps. In Copenhagen, the initiative was taken and a commitment was made for $100 billion by the global community, especially the countries of the North or the Annex 1 countries in the nomenclature of the UNFCCC process so far, and a specialized mechanism was also established under the GCF. What we see right now is the GCF has only been able to roll out just over $10 billion of funding in about 190 projects, and similarly, the commitment for $100 billion is still very far to be achieved. There are several angles, there are several dimensions to look at the financing challenge or the financing puzzle. And at the same time, what complicates the picture even more is how the numbers have been calculated and how they have been quantified. Several methodologies propped up in the period, which basically shows the flow or the magnitude of the flow of the climate finance. And if we look at the Standing Committee on Climate Finance, which is established under the UNFCCC process, and they're talking about much bigger numbers, much higher numbers in terms of the flow. But then their methodology is very flexible and liberal, and which basically accounts for whatever dollar or the penny or the rupees basically flow from goes into any kind of a climate action. But in strict sense, although we do not have any defined definition for climate finance, but what is being used and utilized is very functional and operative definitions. And very recently, OECD came up with a much more realistic numbers and based on the expectations of the developing countries, and they actually came up with a number which is actually around just over $83 billion. And so this is the kind of a magnitude of funding which we are talking in terms of the climate finance. Now, when we combine this and we look into the context and the perspective of what is needed, and I think this really becomes the $83 billion, and even with a 10 to 20% of up and down, this number really becomes a very small and not even kind of a mentionable, because what we are talking about is the financing gaps on the mitigation side, the number of studies which are showing that the mitigation or any action which can keep the global temperature rise within the limits of the Paris Agreement target, the numbers are something in just over $1 trillion, and that predominantly in terms of the energy transition, because the bulk of the emissions are actually coming from the energy sector directly or indirectly. So, and whereas on the adaptation side, the things are even more muddier. And although it is no methodology, no science has actually evolved to the level where the numbers for adaptation can become credible, but still what we are talking about is something in the tune of $300 billion per annum. And this is a number which actually coming from a very recent report from IPCC. I think in one of the decisions or one of the outcome of Glasgow Climate Compact was the climate finance delivery plan, and some action actually did take place out of that, and some workshops did take place in the subsidiary sessions for the climate finance delivery plan under the presidency of United Kingdom. So there was a mentioning here as well earlier on, and we did that, and we hear that as well, which is about the doubling up the climate finance on adaptation side. I think if we know the kind of a global goal on adaptation, and again actually coming from the IPCC, and then we can combine it with the numbers, with the flow of the finance which is actually being dedicated to adaptation. So this is 40 billion right now. So even soon after the COP27, or one fine morning, we do actually come up with the doubling up of the finance on adaptation side. We're still talking about something around 80 to 100 billion dollars, and this is still a far away from $300 billion requirements, which is there from IPCC. Now, several other studies actually contest the number of IPCC for $300 billion, because what we know for sure is this is what is required is much more than that. So I think just to build this context, to give you a little bit of the background, is just to show how tricky this whole climate finance question is. And given a long history of the 30 years of the Climate Change Convention, not much progress has been done. Now you can say that also with a similar degree of convenience as well, that not much progress has been done on the emissions level as well. If we see the trajectory from 1992 onwards, or whatever baseline you want to put in, and what we're seeing is the numbers of the global emissions have been constantly increasing, and the expectations or the estimates which we are seeing from the NDCs, it is that we are nowhere anywhere close to the goals which are set in the Paris Agreement. There are several ways of looking at it. One of my own favorite is the shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs or SSP1. These are the 5 scenarios which have been worked out with the global body of scientists and economists. And one of the richness, one of the credibility of this particular approach is that it's not really looking at the crude emissions number, but it is actually going beyond into the socioeconomic perspectives and the context of it. Now, the 5 SSPs or shared socioeconomic pathways, none of them actually is right now pointing or predicting that we are going to be landing into the safe zone, into these those figures which actually keep the global average temperature increase below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And actually, some of the studies are actually showing the way the population growth is increasing and the economic growth is increasing, that we are actually somewhere in the range of between 3 to 4 degrees centigrade. Now, if you look this into Pakistani context, yeah, this is what we know in Pakistan is the global the average temperature increase has been 0.8 degrees, and the kind of impact we're seeing is already devastating. So I think 3 to 4 degrees centigrade, even 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade is really, really unthinkable, unimaginable. And of course, none of us would want to live into that kind of scenario and not even leave this country or this region or this society to live into that kind of situation. So, I mean, given that when we have this dramatic increase of emissions, and then none of the NDCs analysis and the pathway that are actually showing any decrease, what is needed is really a drastic reductions. And no matter how drastic reductions we are talking about, we will need quite a huge and impactful adaptation measures, which brings me back, of course, to the adaptation financing issue, and again to the aspect that the $300 billion which we are talking about is so far unachievable, unmatchable, and we do not really see this the kind of a commitment which is coming from the global community. Now, COP27 is about implementation. We've been hearing about that. It's taking the Glasgow and the Paris Agreement forward. I think there are a few things which I just want to kind of lay out for discussion, and what should be done and what must be done in the COP27 if we are and the global community is serious, and I'm sure they are. I think there are a few things, there are 4 or 5 points which I just want to lay out that which is needed, and this whole kind of conundrum has to be solved at the next COP. So one is the financing mechanism for loss and damage, and this was a headline question for COP26 and even many before COPs. I happened to be in the forefront in Warsaw COP when the Warsaw International Mechanism was agreed, and there was a lot of excitement for loss and damage, but we know that we've seen that this has really lost its favoritism because of very obvious reason, because and it's not that the northern countries or the Annex 1 countries, they are kind of shying away from it. It's because the numbers which has been come up and some assessment work has been done, they are just they are gigantic numbers, they are huge numbers, and no country and no global financial mechanism can really match up to those numbers. But nevertheless, I think the monster need to be dealt with, and that need to be dealt with in the next COP. I haven't seen this kind of finding a very credible place in the agenda of COP27. As someone who has actually been in the COP process for a long time, and I can know with a degree of confidence why is this the case. But I think that as the Madam Minister mentioned earlier on, I think we need to really make it happen at the next COP. The other one is the second point is scale up support for adaptation, and COP26 actually made this commitment for doubling up the adaptation finance, but now with the new figures, we know that even it is doubled or quadrupled, I think we're still not going to be meeting the need, and the financial gap still remains. There's a lot of talk about innovative financing mechanism and the new financial instruments, which of course can play a big role into it. But I think when we're talking about the finance adaptation, when there is no service or a product at the end of the pipeline, it becomes increasingly difficult to bring the private sector into it and to mobilize any scalable private sector finance for adaptation purposes. So this remains a kind of an unanswered question, but I think this somehow need to be addressed as well. The third one is to strengthen the emission reduction targets. As we know from the some of the NDCs which have been submitted already, we know that we are far away by any analysis. We are far away from 1.5 degree target, and so I think in terms of the framework of implementation for this target, I think this need to be addressed as well. A very good and healthy discussion need to be happen at the NDC synthesis report, which actually is very insightful, how to scale up the ambition, how to increase ambition, and come up with the real emission reduction targets, which are meaningful in the framework of the Paris Climate Agreement. The 100 billion is still unmet. I think practical ways need to be figured out at the COP that how the $100 billion need to be met. As I said, there's a need, even if the 100 billion actually is rolled out, there's a need for further commitments, and we are not really seeing that further commitment coming through so far. So I think this is also this should be one of the top agenda item for it. Now, the other thing is, and this applies to the countries like us, like Pakistan, which is the barriers to the access to the finance. Sometimes there is a finance available, and especially for some of the most critical and vulnerable sectors, but then there's a question of the capacity of our national institutions, as well as the capacity of the institutions on the other side of the dividing line, who actually have to make this financing available. So the whole picture of climate finance, or the accessing climate finance, is extremely cumbersome, and many countries and many national institutions have not been really able to get their heads around. So I think the streamlining of the process is also an extremely important agenda item, and those somehow need to be addressed. Mutaba mentioned about the transparency in reporting on climate finance, and I think that particular issue is not only limited to climate finance, but I think it relates to many other aspects as well. And if we are, and we should be going to implement the provisions of the Paris Agreement, I think the reporting framework need to be enhanced, and they need to be strengthened tremendously. When it comes to the climate finance, I think there is a huge misunderstanding, and there are many different versions of understanding that what is climate finance, what is the flow from one country to the other country, and because one of the biggest kind of a challenge as well as the concern is that the very traditional and conventional financial assistance and aid has been actually being labeled right now for climate finance as well. So I think the reporting becomes extremely important, and there the developing countries has to take a much more instrumental role and come up with the implementable and viable methodologies which are acceptable to on the both sides of the divide, both from Annex 1, non-Annex 1 developing or non-developing countries. So these are just a few things or a few pointers I just want to highlight, and I think the key point basically remains there are huge financial gaps remains. After extreme hue and cry in the last many decades, we have been able to inch towards $83 billion of climate finance, and this is coming from the latest study from OECD. There's a lot of talk about doubling up adaptation finance, which of course is not going to be sufficient either. So I thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Abid Suleri, who is the Executive Director at STPI, and he will be discussing mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin with thanking Ambassador Nadeem Riaz for co-hosting this event. It has become sort of ritual that before every COP, we come here, we gather here at IRS. Thanks to Aisha Khan of CSCCC and IRS for this collaboration. I think this collective action, it would go a long way. Now, in the first session, and thanks to very impressive talk and then the documentary by Ministry of Climate Change, it is very clear that if someone has to see how the world would look like in a warming planet, Pakistan this year is a classical example of it. This year we bypassed spring from winter. We jumped into heat waves. There were these forest fires. Then, of course, the sizzling heat, Jacobabad touching 53 degrees Celsius, twice the hottest place on this planet. And then the same Jacobabad, 2 months down the road, is submerged underwater. And of course, there is this Gulf and glacier melting. So everything that can possibly go wrong with climate change is very much visible in Pakistan this year. And that is why mitigation and adaptation is especially important to us. Now, while going to COP27, and as the diplomats sitting here, they will tell us that sign of a successful negotiation is that everyone leaves the room equally unhappy. But this year, perhaps the developing countries, they would be going to COP more unhappy, as they have to unproportionately face the brunt of war in Ukraine and unproportionately face the brunt of climate change. And this would set the tone, and this would set the scene for COP27. Now, climate action, which mean the actions to somehow restrain climate change, climate finance, renewable energy, fossil fuel, and greenhouse gas emission. These would be 5 major agenda points in the COP27. But before talking of climate action, or before talking of mitigation and adaptation, let me now divert to science. There is this group formed, which is called group of scientists, climate scientists, which is called World Weather Attribute. Those of you, if you haven't visited their webpage, please do visit it. This World Weather Attribute, this is a group of scientists from King's College London, from scientists from Paris, from United States, from Netherlands, from India, and climate scientists from all over the world. And they try to attribute the climate change vis-a-vis some of the climate extreme events. And only a few days ago, they issued their initial report on Pakistan's floods, which is eye-opening. And they say that the rise in global temperature by 1.2% is responsible for 75% increase in intensity of rain in Sindh and Balochistan, and 50% increase in frequency of rain in Sindh and Balochistan. So they say that if temperature hasn't risen above 1.2 degrees Celsius, this sort of rain, the probability of it occurring, that could have been reduced by 75% and 50% respectively. Now, this is 1.2 degree Celsius raise. And if I go back to Glasgow COP26, where it was a common consensus by climate scientists that the NDCs which were presented, which were submitted in the Glasgow COP26, they would easily take the temperature rise to 2.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. And by 2050, one can still limit them to 1.9 degrees centigrade, but that would be too fatal. So 1.2 degrees centigrade, if it can show the type of impact that we have seen in Pakistan, just imagine what would happen in this business as usual case, which is an increase to 2.5 degrees centigrade, and a revised, if countries they agree to submit their revised NDCs and they actually implement on them, it would still be 1.9 degrees centigrade hotter than the traditional conventional temperatures. Now, in order to do it, we require mitigation, which means reduction in emission, and we require adaptation, which means learning to live with climate changes. And both of it, it actually depends on climate financing. Bilal very rightly highlighted some of the aspect of climate financing, but just again to throw you some numbers. It is estimated, IPCC reports and other reports, they tell us that developing countries, they would require around $2.4 trillion by year 2030 if we have to take care of our these adaptation needs. $2.3 trillion. Similarly, they tell us that if all the NDCs which are submitted now, if they have to be financed, we require $6 trillion US by year 2030. And comparing it with the pledges and commitments so far, the projections tell us that we will not be able to receive more than $40 billion per year till 2025, because many of the pledges which are being made in the name of climate financing, this is relabeling of existing funds. So like in the floods, we saw that many of the pledges and many of the projects, they were recouped, they were reappropriated for flood relief. Similarly, many of the pledges, the Francis pledges, those would be relabeled and rebranded as climate financing. Now, way forward. The way forward is that the countries, they need to update their NDCs. We have to raise our ambitions to reduce the carbon emissions. But these ambitions, they have to be credible and they must be backed by some sort of long-term and medium-term strategies. Similarly, when it comes to finances, finances have to be easily accessible and they have to be auditable. Accessible, auditable, transparent, that is the three buzzwords here when we talk of finances. And we need to mobilize private sector along with this. And we need to turn the loan for mitigation. Much of the mitigation efforts today, which mean turning to solar plants, which mean power sector reforms, which mean reducing our fossil fuel, most of it is coming as loan. So a group of 77 plus one, which Pakistan would be holding the presidency this year. Their demand is that these loans, they need to be converted into grants. With loans, the countries like Pakistan, we cannot cope against the menace of climate change. And finally, we need to actually think through net zero emission. Net zero emission, while in theory it's a wonderful concept, in practical terms it means when we build our infrastructure projects or motorways and we wipe off 100,000 of trees from that place, and we say that yes, we will plant new trees. So this is exactly what net zero emission can be. So for net zero emission, before entering into any commitment, we need to actually first negotiate a strong regime, accountable regime, a transparent regime, so that this greenwashing cannot be used by developed world in their benefit. And that would again be a lose-lose situation for developing countries when it comes to mitigation and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And our last panelist today is Ms. Aisha Khan, who is the CEO of CSCCC, and she will be discussing loss and damage.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. I realize that we're running behind schedule, so I will be very brief. I'm sure by now all of you are also suffering from climate fatigue, but seeing that, towards the end, the room is still full of people is rather reassuring. Loss and damage, as the Prime Minister had, not the Prime Minister, the Minister of Climate Change indicated, will be a big ticket item. And it's going to be very important because in recent years, developing countries have been suffering losses and damage as a result of climate-induced disasters. So when you keep suffering with something over a period of time, which you think is not directly due to actions that you have taken and it has been imposed on you through external events, I think a certain level of frustration, disappointment does set in. And that is why she was referring to anger, because there is, after a long period of disappointment, a lot of anger that has accumulated now among the developing countries. Just to give you an example, since 2000, over 4 billion lives have been impacted by loss and damage, which has cost almost like 2.9 trillion dollars. So this is attributed directly to extreme weather events. Loss and damage is not really a new demand. This has been going on since 1991-92, and then it got a lot of attention, as Mujtaba Sahib said, during the Warsaw International Mechanism, but it was not made part of the Paris Agreement. So we don't have really a footing where we can anchor loss and damage and demand action for it. However, that doesn't mean that it is not something that matters very deeply and that alters lives and livelihoods. And it's not just the economic losses. We can't start assessing these losses by saying homes, bridges, roads. We have to take the non-economic losses into account. We have to take the secondary and intergenerational losses into account that will haunt us for decades later, and that will really rob the future of the youth. So these are some of the things that Pakistan will take up. Here is, just some quick figures that I want to share with you to actually highlight the importance of loss and damage. Across 2019 and 20, the average annual global financing for climate action came to 632 billion. And this I'm referring to the 100 billion that was pledged by the Annex A countries. Of this, a total of 90% was spent on mitigation, only 7.2 went on adaptation, and the remaining 2 went on these joint activities together. So that means that, loss and damage is actually not being factored in. And when you talk about the Paris Agreement and the absence of loss and damage, let's see what the Paris Agreement actually says. The words that it uses is averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. So loss and damage can be averted by curbing greenhouse gases, which falls under mitigation, and then reducing risks is adaptation. So loss and damage actually doesn't factor into the global green finance. And if we look at the total amount that is committed there, that is why the developing countries don't want that to be fitted or provided through that finance, because that finance is not even enough for mitigation or for adaptation. So if you start taking money out of that pot for loss and damage, it's not going to work. Some more quick figures that I wanted to share with you. Let me see. Because I can't remember all, the trillions no, I don't have them here, but the point is that if, according to a study, you look at or forecast loss and damage, it runs into trillions. And if you have something like about 580 billion up to 7 billion up by 2030, and then you have something from 1 trillion to 1.5 up to 2040, and then beyond that you have up to 1.74 trillion by 2050 that will be required only for covering loss and damages. So we can't say that there is no money available, because if you look at the global GDP, it is 88 trillion. And at the same time, we call climate change an existential threat. So if it's going to kill everybody, destroy the planet, then why are we not redirecting finance? And this is what I think what will be the agenda. We are not going to talk about compensation, reparation, liability. We're just going to look at the human face of the tragedy. And I think that was brought vividly forward by the short documentary that was played. It just tells you how lives are being destroyed. The future of people is being destroyed, and how we cannot actually rebuild and ever compensate them. So the word compensation is out of the window for me. You can never compensate for a lost life that is lost. We just need to make sure that we raise our voices enough over there to get a recognition that loss and damage requires a separate finance facility, and that the countries who are demanding are not doing that to ask for anything unjust or unreasonable. It is a very, very reasonable demand to say, please help us to recover, to rehabilitate. And that is what Pakistan is going to do. We have the presidency of the G77, and we are hoping to use it very effectively. As the minister said, there's a strong contingent going from Pakistan, and this time the government delegation, the civil society, everyone is going to work from one platform for Pakistan. So our voices will have a point of convergence, and the three issues that will be important for Pakistan will be climate finance, we will have mitigation adaptation, and we will have loss and damage. So do not expect any great victory, like she had said. It is a collective effort. It's a block of nations that make an appeal for a certain agenda, and we walk away with some successes. But the only point now the developing countries are making is that the pace is very slow. We've been talking for 27 years, we've run out of time. So we need to accelerate progress, both on ambition on mitigation, drastic reduction in the greenhouse gases is needed, support for adaptation, and along with losses and damages that countries are suffering, need help, assistance, support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we will move on to closing remarks by Ambassador Shafkat Kakakhil, Chairperson, STPI and CSCCC. After this, we will be having a Q&A session, but now I would like Ambassador Shafkat Kakakhil to please take the podium and give his closing remarks.
Well, as the last speakers at any meeting have a tough time, because most of the important things have already been said, and the audience shows signs of fatigue, and they've heard enough. So another old man repeating the same things. But let me try to add as much value. But before I do that, I'd like to offer my very sincere congratulations to the Institute of Regional Studies and the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change for organizing this briefing session to inform you all. And I see a lot of young people and who will be affected by climate change far more seriously than my generation. So you're all here. You heard excellent presentations. It was a very impressive meeting because first, look at the theme of the meeting, from Paris to Sharm el-Sheikh. It's a very, very important theme, and we had ambassadors of France and ambassador of Egypt tell us, give us their perspective, and you could see the areas of agreement and the areas of divergence. But what is important in this theme, from Paris to Sharm el-Sheikh, is that after Paris, all the conferences of parties until Glasgow were the resources, the time and effort were expended on elaborating what the Paris Agreement had included. The Paris Agreement is one of the longest documents in human history. It is in two parts, the preamble and the substantive, both about 15, 16 pages. So if you add up, 30 pages is longer than any agreement or pact or covenant negotiated by nations. Now, but still, despite its size, it could not come up with detailed procedures and operational details. So those were left. A lot of work was done at Katowice in COP24. 25 was a bit of a waste in Madrid. And Glasgow completed what is called the rule book, which basically is what is meant by this, what is meant by this, what is meant by this. Now in Sharm el-Sheikh, the time has come for work to translate the rule book, because the rule book does not deal with abstract subjects. It deals with climate action. And we have to look at the backdrop. For the young guys who are here, I have written 2 articles on the conference in The Nation, in the newspaper. And those of you who are interested can look at them. I reviewed the entire spectrum of issues, and I also looked at the backdrop. What is the backdrop of the Sharm el-Sheikh conference? You have, on the one hand, a substantial increase, both in 2022, 2021, from 2020 onwards, in the extreme weather events that are linked to climate change. In the United States last year alone, there were 25 cyclones because of the vast coastline of the United States. There has been no continent that has remained unaffected. So you're talking about hundreds of events, heat waves, cyclones, long periods of drought, which automatically leads to food security issues and all in Africa. I see harrowing pictures of wildlife in Kenya, where I spent 14 years. These huge, beautiful animals, elephants, turned into skeleton. And instead of the, smart, big, large animals moving with great dignity in the savannah. So the negotiators in Sharm el-Sheikh have to take care of that backdrop, that climate change is now absolutely upon us. It is not tomorrow, it is not day after, it was yesterday and today. And tomorrow is going to be much worse. And who is affected by climate change disproportionately? When you had the Pakistani floods, when the waters in Sindh had still not receded, you had the cyclone Ian in the United States in Florida. The insurance claims alone run into 62 billion. But there is no commotion, there is no excitement, there is no, because the United States of America has the resources to compensate those affected by Ian. And look at the situation in Pakistan. You are talking about 20 billion, 30 billion, but first the number of 33 million, the damage. And everybody is wondering how will the 260 bridges and barrages be repaired? The hundreds of kilometers and all. And that is why in my article, I put loss and damage, which is not an agenda item of the conference. They are now pushing for, developing countries are pushing for loss and damage to be discussed as a separate item. And that is where the loss and damage problem, because developing countries are massively, disproportionately, and in the most cruel manner affected, ravaged by the impacts of climate change. So as far as the attitude, you heard the French ambassador saying the Paris Agreement did not recognize the financial aspects of loss and damage. But from what I have seen, there is so much anger, there is so much frustration in the developing world, in the least developed countries, that I am worried, and I put it in my second article, that it could derail the conference. It could endanger the conference. But on the other hand, I hear positive statements. Shukri Sameh, the foreign minister of Egypt, and has been talking to virtually scores of ministers every day. John Kerry, United States climate envoy, has made some more helpful statements. But for developing countries, it's going to be a serious matter. The second issue is, of course, the question of finance. Finance has several aspects. One is the adequacy of finance. 100 billion was thought of by Obama in Copenhagen. We were there. He was negotiating with the Brazil president, with the Chinese, with others, and it sounded like a sexy figure. But that was how many years ago? Between 2009 and 2030. if you take normal inflation, and then what have you delivered? There's a wonderful article by my niece, Kashmala, on climate finance for the third poll. And she says there is also the question of who's counting. The OECD says we gave 83.3 billion in 2020. Oxfam says the real monies strictly for climate action, no more than 10 billion. So climate change, there is a problem of adequacy. There is a problem of the focus. What are you spending the money on? It was mentioned by speakers, mitigation, which means you cut your emissions and you place your industry, your economy, your society, your lifestyle on a less carbon consuming trajectory. And there is adaptation. So far, the maximum amount for adaptation was 20%. So finance is a huge issue. And the other issue is I must look at my, so LND is, I think, the number one issue, regardless of what the agenda says. The agenda may not have LND. If the rich countries refuse and the developing countries decide not to boycott the conference. You know, I have been in this business for 30 years. I complete 30 years this month. What developing countries do, they push hard for their positions, which are backed by science and by fact. They push hard, but at the end, they realize that the only show in town is the United Nations show. So they accept the best deal they can negotiate. And this is exactly what has been happening, whether it's the question of loss and damage. In Glasgow, according to Harjeet Singh and Salim al-Haq, it was almost there 2 days before the conclusion of the conference. And then in the last 48 hours, financial mechanism is turned into a dialogue on financing arrangements. So the third subject that is going to be important is mitigation. Are developed countries doing enough? No, because there has been a net increase in emissions. Who is emitting? 80% of the emissions come from the rich countries. So developed countries have failed to fulfill their commitment on mitigation and on adaptation. But developing countries will urge them, they will push them, and on the last day of the conference, accept the best deal they can negotiate, because as I told you, where else do we go? Is there any other quarter for redressing our grievances? No. So another demand will be, please, you promised this figure of 100 billion. Fulfill that. Give us cast iron guarantees. Because the situation is bad, both for developing countries and for everybody. The temperature increase. 1.5 was the guardrail that if you restrict the increase in temperature compared to the pre-industrial revolution to 1.5, you may save yourself the worst consequences. That's what a guardrail means. According to scientific analysts, we might reach this by 2025. And then we are in for a massive process of disruptions and aberrations of weather, throwing food security in jeopardy and all kinds of other needs and requirements of life. If you look at Glasgow, I made a list of 18 to 20 commitments by non-state actors, businesses, and there's also states about deforestation, about net zero carbon, all that. But there is no mechanism to ensure compliance. So that will be one of the themes of the Sharm el-Sheikh will be, when you make a promise, please give us guarantees for fulfillment. And so these are basically the issues. Coming back to Pakistan, we have a dynamic minister. We have senior officials who know, and they will be there. And we have a strong team from New York, because Pakistan is the chair of G77, 135 to 140 countries. So there's going to be a hell of a lot of work. The Pakistani civil society, as Aisha Khan mentioned, has been and will support the government. There is no divergence between us and what the government is doing. There is no antagonism between the two camps. There is antagonism between governments and civil society in the rich countries. But in the developing countries, both camps are united on this existential challenge of climate change. I think I've spoken more than enough, and I wish to thank you for listening to my harangue. And please take interest in climate change, because it's going to vitally affect all the young people and in the near future. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your comprehensive and illuminating remarks. Now we're going to open the floor for a Q&A session. I apologize. I realize that everyone has been sitting for a very long time, but we will be going towards refreshments after that. But I know everyone's waiting to ask questions. So please raise your hand and then we'll give you the mic.
Want to congratulate the organizing for organizing such an informative session. And then I will be requesting to the all panelists, please bear with me. I have the number of the concerns from today's discussion. And please do have the courage to have some question on that, because a number of the time people mention here, even our minister mentioned that there are the angry, countries who are talking, and they're not very much concerned about the impacts that climate is having on the people life. So here you have in this room is the angry nation as well, and who have the lots of questions to all the stakeholders who are sitting in this table. So some of my questions are related to the minister's speech, and I'm sure the ministry person is here to take my words there and get some answer for that. So first of all, I just really would like to comment on the effectiveness of this COP forum, because we heard a lot about from different speakers that we have to manage our expectations. But why do we have to manage our expectations? If this all multilateralism are not coming up to any conclusion or a tangible action, then what's the point of having this whole multilateral system in the world? We know there are long-standing dispute, and it's not the climate, it's the other issue as well. So I think when our country have the position? Like in the last speech, the person said that we are the part of the G7 members. So why don't we influence to the right stakeholders that hold these multilateral system accountable and make them work? And the other point related to that, this is not binding. And then what we are going to do, that we are going to have something in our NDCs, and then we are going to implement that. So to related to that, I have the number of the questions related to the climate finance as well. I mean, we heard a lot about, but when we are talking about the climate finance specifically in the Pakistan, so do we have the complete action plan? For that, we are asking the finance for it, because if you see, as being the part of working of this humanitarian sector, I also have the objective on the minister point when she said that the needs are changing because the needs are different from this year from the past disaster. But if you see the 2010 flood, 2005 incident in Pakistan, so after that we came up number of the set of the authorities, so where we are failing politically, administratively, economically, and socially, that we can't manage the disaster on the ground, because we do have some strong early warning.
Sorry, excuse me.
Function.
Can you just
let me speak.
No, I'll let you speak, but can you please address the questions?
Okay. So do we have the complete action plan for those financing things as well? And then she mentioned there is a group of 77 who's going to attend the COP27. So do we have the complete engagement plan for that group, that they are going to engage the different stakeholders over there and have the possible actions for this thing? So there are the number of the things that in my mind, and I hope that the panelists here can respond on it.
Oh, okay. So there's a related question, and then whoever would like to answer that.
Like to ask this.
That 4 trillion US dollar less would be produced over the next 4 years in the developed world. That is equivalent to the economy GDP of the Germany. In 4 years, Qatar and we are structured in a wrong way by asking poor, they cannot give you anything.
Sorry, just one more question, and then you can answer them together.
Thank you so much. My name is, and I have a couple of concerns and questions.
Sir, sorry, respectfully, just questions, not concerns. At this time, we have a shortage of time.
So why not we can show our concerns?
Okay, you can put them in the question.
Okay, thank you. It is a wonderful discussion once again to have a number of people talking about climate change and its frameworks. My question and concern is that what about the implementation of the frameworks that we have? First of all, we spent a lot of money on forests, but what about deforestation? Who will control deforestation in the high mountains? Number one. We have spent a lot of several millions, about $35 million on glove. Why Shishpur always bursting out since for last 5-6 years, and about the other 300 plus glove glacier lakes. Third, in the recent times, in the recent year, we have allowed 2 more fossil fuel producing for fossil fuel consuming vehicle productions in Pakistan. What about electric vehicle that we had to announce? Another question. We are excavating coal, and we are planning more coal-fired plants in Pakistan. Though you call it, we have zigzag, what do you call it? but you will be producing some of the emissions. Your vehicles producing a lot of emissions. And what about the green energy potential that we have, and why we are not? And the last concern and question, that is, we had regulation against plastic bags. When we finalized the draft, that was single-use shopping bags. Why cannot we amend the act again to cover single-use shopping bags and plastic bottles? When Supreme Court of Pakistan has also given its verdict about the excavation of groundwater harvesting that the bottlers are using free of cost, who are blindfolded home? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm just going to let the panelists address these questions first. And also, please, a reminder, ask one question per person so that we can get more questions to the panelists. Thank you.
I think if I have not forgotten all the concerns or questions, but let me address one first question regarding the failure of unilateral mechanism. You see, the multilateral mechanism, if we don't have such mechanisms in place, then we would not have a dialogue to show our problems and find a solution for it. So I guess I wouldn't call it a successful process, but I would call it a platform where we can raise our voice. And unless and until we don't have such mechanisms in place, so there will be no platform for discussion. So the UNFCCC process actually emanated from a very successful, and I, in my opening speech, called it a landmark agreement to raise the issue of environment and development. That is called the Mother Convention of all conventions. So that's where the whole debate about environment actually was flagged on the global scene. So the thing is that, in my understanding, unless and until you have such platforms and mechanisms, you will not be able to raise the issues that you would like to find the solutions for. So first response on that. So my friend, if I recall your name, Munir Saab, raised a number of concerns. So deforestation, restricting or